So we're talking about this idea of a ritual of getting in, right, to a sectarian group. I'm trying to use your words here, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So then how do you see Acts 16 and Paul circumcising Timothy because of the Jews?
Oh, that's a good question.
So,
Yeah,
so it's
let me ask you that. Let me answer that question with another question.
Let me finalize the question, though, because now what we're getting into is circumcision. We know, I believe, and I think that you would agree with me fully, that the idea of circumcision was not done away with Paul. Paul was not saying, don't get circumcised. That part of the covenant's gone, right?
Correct.
Okay, so if someone is a covenant member, they should be circumcised. It seems, though, like in this passage, Paul circumcised Timothy in some form of a ritual because he does it for the Jews. It's not because Timothy's a covenant member. Go.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think that Paul, I haven't looked at that passage for a while, but clearly we can say this. Paul, if we read Galatians 5 to mean that, and this is the way FFOZ and others do, that for whoever is circumcised becomes obligated to all the rabbinic halakha, then that's what's happening here.
But that's late. But that's a late. But now you're reading in, right?
No, I know. I'm saying if we were to adopt the FFOZ approach,
yes, okay,
we would have to say that Timothy fell for Messiah here, right? We would have to if we, how come Timothy didn't assert his liberty to not
being under grace?
You know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions we could ask. So, that's a good question. You're looking at, I just pulled it up. It's Acts 16. Verse 3.
Yeah.
And the phrase is dia tus Judaios tus antasentois topois kenois, which means the dia it can mean like because of the Jews that were in that place. Now there's flexibility on this preposition dia. Is it because of, in other words, because of fear of? No, I don't think it's because of fear of. I think that dia probably has a larger semantic swath, and it doesn't have to be. In other words, let's say there weren't Jews in that place. Do you think Timothy still would have been circumcised?
Well, and that's kind of the point.
I think he would have been.
Well, I think Paul. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this passage, no doubt, and I think that Timothy would have been circumcised at some point, no matter what. I think that he wasn't. I think that Paul spoke against going through a ritual of conversion, or not. I'm sorry, going through a ritual of circumcision if you thought that it gained you something in Christ's eyes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so by this point, it's obvious that Timothy is not of that mindset. But it almost sounds like, to me, and I could be way off on this, it almost sounds like maybe Paul would have waited a little bit longer, but because of the Jews in the area, Timothy wouldn't have been accepted in, or I don't know. Timothy wouldn't have been accepted into the Jewish communities unless he went through this ritual. This kind of or unless he was considered in, and however that would be. So when we talk about these different Jewish sectarian groups, it seems as though he's being accepted into a vast amount of these groups. It's not just like one small sectarian group, like the Qumran sect or something he needs to go talk to. It seemed because it says of the Jews in the area, right? Sure. Or in the region.
And sure, and he's under Paul's wing.
Absolutely.
Right? I think Timothy probably, let's look at it. We know from the letters, the epistles to Timothy, that his mother and his grandmother were Jewish, right? And he grew up with the scriptures. But obviously, his father was Greek, and Timothy probably was viewed, and we don't know if his father was still alive or not at this point, but he probably was viewed with some suspicion. In other words, he was probably felt slightly different than those, the local Jewish community that was very intense in their and scrupulous in their observance. He probably felt a little bit like an outsider. And it was under Paul's wing that he came to learn to walk around in those circles. Paul didn't have any problem walking in any of those circles, like he says in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the Jew, to those under the law. Yeah. All those are presumably Jewish spaces. Paul is fluent in the tradition. He's fluent in the gospel, and he's going to be equally comfortable and maybe uncomfortable in any of those situations. And so definitely Timothy, he's training up Timothy, and this is part of that.
Okay, but let's take it back now. Let's take it back to Ephesians, to the Ephesians 2 passage.
Okay,
because it seems like what you're saying, like we're agreeing here. We're agreeing on the Acts 16 passage. It seems like Timothy is circumcised in some way to be accepted. In other words, to get in to be accepted into these groups, right? So, whatever sectarian group this might have been, whatever Jewish sectarian group this might have been. So now back to the Ephesians 2 passage, 2:19. My original point was that it seems as though, to me, I would think that Paul is avoiding this word proselytos. And my suggestion is that he's avoiding this word because it might denote some ritual that would get you acceptance into a sectarian group. Do you reject that, or do you think that is a possible valid reason why Paul wouldn't use the word proselytos in Ephesians 2:19?
So what you're asking is, what you're noticing something. You're noticing, okay, here's a place where Paul's talking about citizenship and being one in Messiah between Jew and Gentile, but he's not using the word proselyte. So you're making that observation, right?
Yes.
And then you're going from that to say, you're suggesting Paul knows the word proselyte, but he's deliberately not using it here because he knows his readers know the word, and it will give them the wrong idea.
Correct.
I think that's a fair.
Because I think that Paul is obviously well aware of his Torah and of the Torah, and he knows Exodus 12:49. He knows Numbers 15:15 and 16.
Right. He wants to give a new category. Paul wants people. Yeah. Here's Paul's aim. What's Paul's aim? To teach. He's got a couple main aims. One is to preach the gospel, of course, to teach people how to navigate in their life, how to think about the gospel. In other words, how the gospel relates to the Tanakh and how it applies to their purity of their heart and their treatment of each other. How, in other words, Shema and V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, right? And love your neighbors yourself. And then Paul's other PowerPoint there is to protect the space for those little seedlings, the Word of God being preached, to protect those little sprouts from all the noise and fear and honor-shame dynamics of the existing chaos in the Jewish world, with all the sectarianism and all the you got to do this, no, you got to do this to be righteous. Oh, that's not Messiah, this is Messiah. All that noise, Paul wants to protect the new believers from that chaos and build them up and edify them with the scriptures and with just the word of the gospel. That's what he says, the forming of Messiah in you. He's saying, this is about the new covenant. This is what about God does in the hearts of the individual believer. All hearts are purified by faith in Messiah. That's what God does. It's equally true for Jew and Gentile alike. And we need to protect that space. Therefore, there are certain words inherited from Tanakh, like Messiah, New Covenant, right? Things like this that are now, this is a closed loop. Those, we know what those are now. We're not arguing about Messiah anymore. We're not arguing about what New Covenant is from Jeremiah. We're not arguing about Isaiah 53 and what it means. These things are closed loops. It's a sealed deal. But we're also going to avoid the noise of present Jewish sectarianism, and this is what you're getting at, is that this word proselyte is one of, just adds to the noise.